somebody that may have made a mistake.
When I think of prisoners, I think of uh, violent thugs, criminals who have done crimes outside, like in society.
Okay, so when I think of prisoners, I think it depends on more of why they're in prison. I don't really put a meaning to prisoner until I know the case, because some people are in prison and considered prisoners even though like they didn't commit the crime or like they were falsely accused. So it just all depends on the case and why they're in there.
I do think there's systems in place that allow them to change, and they do change over time. You know, like their guilt, and they just want to go back into society by becoming and bettering themselves.
I do think prisoners change just because the environment they're in when they're in prison is a lot different from society. So when they're out in the world, it's like if they really did commit the crime, I feel like them going in there and them going into prison and living that life as a prisoner, they realize they have to make a change in their life. And because if they come back, if they're released from jail and if they're released from prison and they're entering the real world again, they obviously wouldn't want to go back in, so they do have to make that change in their life.
Prisoners could change. Some of them. Nah.
I think so, yes. I remember seeing like a treatment, just like everyday interaction, social like behaviors.
Yes, I do think prisons dehumanize people because when you're in prison, you're like known as a number or you're under the people in charge. So the guards, for example, like the Stanford experience, like those prisoners were dehumanized because they were known as their number, not as a name. Like, so for example, like you're John Doe, you're not known as John Doe, you're known as inmate number 123. So yeah, I guess they do that. In that sense, they are dehumanized.
It could dehumanize prisoners. I know a lot of people in solitary confinement do sometimes become dehumanized. So that could happen.
When you're in prison, basically you're told every single day in word and in deed that you're not really a human. You're treated in ways that humans aren't allowed to be treated in any other circumstance. You're treated in ways that animals are not allowed to be treated. So it definitely assaults your self-esteem from the minute you get there. And it certainly doesn't raise the way you feel about society, because you sort of equate society as doing this to us, you know. So it's a very complicated thing. And then of course, most all prisoners are in fact guilty of crimes. So there's a question of shame and guilt as well. So those things kind of balance together, and you end up with it's very difficult to maintain a good self-esteem in prison. So I would say, you know, in a philosophical way, no, it does not eliminate, nothing can eliminate a person's humanity. But then in a functional sense, it does in fact take away your humanity. So people who are sentenced to life without the possibility of parole are no less human than anyone else. However, they are in a position that's extremely inhuman, and they're treated as less than human essentially for the rest of their lives. So it's a kind of yes or no answer, I guess. I think it's unquestionable that people of color are treated worse. I also believe that class has a big part of it, because while there are all kinds of races in prisons, there are virtually no rich people. So, you know, one could make the argument that maybe class has as much to do with it as race, but as a white man, I realize that I see it from a different reality than people of color. So I don't want to speak for them. But clearly, people of color are treated worse. African Americans are treated worst of all. In the criminal justice system, in prison, by the guards, by the administration. white people are probably treated better than most other groups. I can't deny that, and I probably benefited from that different times along the way. The nutshell of it, I think, is, like many people in prison when I was a kid, I didn't feel that I was loved. And I realize that can sound really trite and so that doesn't justify anything. But for a kid who doesn't feel loved, then he comes to hate himself. And then it sort of comes out from him to hate everybody around him. And most people in prison have experienced similar things. They feel like they're not wanted. They feel like they're useless. They're worthless. So when I was a kid, I didn't feel loved. And when I met a woman who fell in love with me in 1983-ish, it was sort of like a chink in that armor that I had built up from when I was a little boy and grew up feeling unloved. And it began a process in me that ultimately resulted in me realizing that I was in fact lovable. And if I'm lovable, then that must mean I'm not all bad. Because I had been told most of my life that I was just bad. I was evil, you're terrible, blah, blah, all that. And it didn't happen overnight. It's not like, I love you, and the next day I was, walking around, with a halo on or anything. I was still a blockhead for a really long time, but it definitely began to shift in me. And, to put a slightly less, romantic thing on it, this is also the time that I was getting into my mid-20s, when we now know that, men's brains begin to harden up and, we're able to think clearly. Young men have a hard time thinking, and I certainly had a hard time thinking longer than most young men. So I think those two things combined, I grew up, my brain matured in a literal way, and I developed relationships with people who looked at me as a good person and, cared about me, and those things combined. And then maybe my own innate stubbornness, I'm kind of a stubborn, persistent guy, and I wanted to be a better person. So all of those things together, I think, is how I changed from who I was to who I am now.
Thank you.